Hello, and welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. My name is Gabriel Mullen, and I am a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The Dole Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members can access many great opportunities through their involvement with the Institute, including volunteering at programs and networking with our special guests. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu or speaking with a student worker after the program. After the presentation, we will have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. If you have difficulty hearing during the program, please alert one of our staff members or student volunteers who will assist you. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. And now, please join me in welcoming. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Barbara Ballard.
Thank you, Gabe. We're always pleased to have our students do our welcome in the evening. So I'll say good evening to everyone and welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics and tonight's program, the Class of '74 Congress After Watergate. Tonight's interview will be conducted by KU Professor of Political Science and a friend of the Dole Institute, Burdett Loomis. Following tonight's program, we will hold a book sale and a sighting with our guest in the back of Hanson Hall. Our guest tonight is the author of the Class of '74 Congress After Watergate and the Roots of Partisanship. He served 38 years as a staff member in the U.S. House of Representatives, including the final 8 as Chief of Staff to Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Upon his retirement in 2013, Speakers John A. Boehner and Pelosi conferred on him the John W. McCormick Award for Excellence for dedication to the House and bipartisanship. He teaches at the University of California's Washington Center and has lectured widely at institutions across the nation. In addition to his book, his writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Politico, and the Los Angeles Times. It is a pleasure to welcome our guest this evening. And ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming John Lawrence.
And John makes the point early on and often and absolutely correctly that we think of this group as coming in the wake of Watergate as some kind of unitary force. Not so, on a whole variety of ways. Some were professional politicians, some were the rankest amateurs. Some were very liberal, some were quite conservative. So this group comes together and changes the institution in various ways that they're not completely conscious of at the time. And one of the nice things about John's book is he's gone back and interviewed many of the class of 1974, and they get their reflections on that period of the mid-'70s. So I'd like to start out, John, with just can you give a little background about how the class of '74 came to be in the context of 1972, 73, 74, and the election of November 1974?
Sure, and can I just start off by thanking Bill and Barbara and Bert, obviously, for giving me this opportunity to come out to the University of Kansas, to the Dole Center in particular. It's a real honor for me to be able to come out to a center that devotes itself to the study of Congress, because those of us who do study Congress are painfully aware of how difficult it is to do and how difficult a story it is to tell in an interesting way, as opposed to presidents who thoughtfully put all their papers in one library and name it for themselves. And you know, that's great, but when it's Congress and there's 535 of them and they're changing on an ongoing basis, it's pretty difficult. So to be able to come to a center like this, which recognizes the importance of preserving and making available to scholars the works of significant political leaders like Bob Dole, it's for me a special honor to be able to come out. So when you think back of the atmosphere, as Bert mentions, you know, there's a certain familiar ring. You have a president who's been elected in a controversial election where there's talk about election tampering. There's a special prosecutor who's looking into abuses in that campaign in the White House and the White House staffs. There's a long unpopular war. There's a lot of division within the American electorate. And there's a lot of disenchantment with government, particularly with the Congress. People felt that there was a slew of issues that Vietnam among them, but there were issues that were bubbling up from below, whether that was environmental policy, women's policy, special education, consumer protection, the energy policy, that Congress, because of the way in which it was structured, was simply not capable of addressing. It was a very archaic institution in some ways, largely in the House and Senate because of seniority systems that rewarded people based upon age, which is looking better to me now as I get older, but that had little to do either with their record of supporting the majority party, their own party, or their expertise. It had to do with simply their age, which in and of itself, incidentally, was a reform of an earlier age that, like many reforms, has unintended consequences that don't work out the right way. And there was frustration also within the Congress. Really starting by the mid-50s, there are groups of people within the House of Representatives, and I'm predominantly talking here about Democrats, and I'll explain why in a moment, who are coming out of the World War II experience. They're veterans. They're coming out of a different milieu in terms of civil rights, in terms of the changing economy, in terms of their own districts, educational levels are changing. And they're a more progressive group, and they're constantly trying to change the way in which Congress is functioning so as to empower a broader diversity of people within the institution. The institution isn't really created that way. Even people we think of as congressional powerhouses like Sam Rayburn really did not have anything approaching the kind of authority that ideally a speaker would like to have. And having worked for a speaker, I know what it's like to want to have that kind of power. And so there were these reform efforts that were underway. Now, I mentioned the Democrats. Let me just really quickly say, the reason is Democrats were thought to be almost the default majority in the House of Representatives. And they were, of course, were so because they had this very large slew of conservative Democrats in the South. Those people tended to be much more conservative than the Democratic Party nationally. They tended to be more conservative in many cases than the Republican Party nationally. And because of the seniority, and they didn't have a Republican Party to worry about, the seniority system elevated them to positions of seniority and to chairmanships where they exercised under the committee system this incredible power. So there were these efforts by Democratic reformers, James Roosevelt, Julia Hanson, Dick Bowling, developed these, Gene McCarthy. There were these little informal organizations, and then the Democratic Study Group emerged as a more substantial one that began to push for changes, to break down that absolute control. They had some successes, particularly in 1973, in terms of making some changes in the absolute autonomy of the chairman, but they were not able to make any significant changes in terms of the seniority system itself. Until this class arrives in 1974. And one of the things that's important about this group of people, they didn't run for Congress. I asked all of them, why did you run in 1974? And some of them had run earlier, but a lot of them had not. And I fully expected, because the popular literature, and the asterisk here is nothing I say about the popular literature refers to Burdett Loomis, who actually knows this group at least as well and maybe better than I do. everybody said, well, you know, this was the Watergate Babies, a term I refuse to use. They came to Washington. They threw out 3 chairmen. There were a bunch of disreputable, irresponsible people who didn't respect the institution. And then we don't know what happened to them. You know, they ceased to exist as an entity in the popular literature. The History of Congress by Bob Remini has less than 1 page, 500 pages in the History of Congress, less than 1 page to the group that Norm Ornstein calls the most consequential class in the 20th century. They show up, but they don't show up with a bunch of reforms in hand. The reforms are all there beforehand. What they didn't have beforehand is they didn't have the numbers. And then these guys show up, and as Bella Abzug says one day when they walk into the Democratic caucus, they say, well, the reinforcements have arrived. And suddenly they had the votes.
So that really does get me to kind of a follow-on question here, because you had a lot of people who were quite unprepared. Some were prepared. My boss, Paul Simon, had been lieutenant governor. He'd run for governor. He was a political pro. He walked in, had ideas from day one. Bob Edgar from Pennsylvania, minister, 31 years old, had to look up Democratic Party in the phone book to figure out where he's going to go to learn to run. I'm sure he had no real idea of what was going to happen. And I think that he was more the norm than Paul Simon. So maybe we might want to talk about a couple of these key reforms. The idea, for example, of being able to put the pressure on and in the end vote out committee chairs. I mean, committee chairs had been the powers that be in Congress, and yet the previous reforms had opened the door. And so what happened when this class got there?
Yeah, so let me just back up for a second to give everybody the context. So as I mentioned briefly, the seniority system was actually a reform. It was instituted in 1910 in the rebellion against Speaker Cannon as a response to the tradition, which was that the speaker simply designated who he wanted to be the chairman of the committee. And then the chairman of the committee were virtually all powerful. They decided who was on subcommittees, what the subcommittees were, who the staff was. And when the revolt happened, they took that power away from the speaker, and they said, let's just base it on whoever happens to be alive the longest. If you could draw a breath, you were the chair. And that defined some of them from time to time. But this group became more, because it was so disproportionately centered in the South, but also it was older members. It didn't reflect this influx of people coming in the elections of 58 and 60 and 64 and 72. They were out of touch with the caucus, and many of these chairmen were voting 60, 70% of the time with the Republicans. They were voting against their own. Committee members. So much power was in the committees that even if you could get a bill out of a committee that had a somewhat liberal or centrist point of view, you would run into first of all, the chairman may not even take it to the Rules Committee. If it went to the Rules Committee chairman, who was one of these guys, Howard Smith from Virginia, could simply stop it. The Rules Committee largely operated independent of the speaker. So you had this enormous amount of power concentrated in these limited numbers of hands. The Democratic caucus and the Republicans both decided in the early 1970s to abandon seniority as an absolute rule. So you could take into account other conditions, and you could vote. They were allowed to vote on chairman, but the Steering and Policy Committee still, which was fairly new, still was heavily dominated by more traditional members and did not recommend getting rid of members, of chairmen. When this class of 74 comes in, the numbers change pretty dramatically. There are 49 pickup of 49 seats, 76 new Democratic members, 291 members altogether. And the ratios are now very different. And they did an incredible thing. They formed a new members caucus, and they invited the chairman to come and speak to the new members caucus to explain why they should be chairman. Well, the chairman didn't even know what they were talking about. So they sent a note back and said, well, we're not coming. We don't do that. You're not even members of Congress yet. I mean, this is in December of 1974. And the freshmen sent a note back and said, well, that's okay, then we won't vote for you. So they all came, except one. Jim Haley was too sick to come. He still got confirmed. And they came before the new members caucus, and they literally had to explain why they should be reelected. And some of them didn't do very well. Edward Hebert, who was the chair, I see some of you know Edward Hebert. So he was the chairman of the Armed Services Committee from Louisiana, very, very conservative, segregationist, very pro-Vietnam War. Quick little story about him. In 1973, Pat Schroeder, who was a freshman, Ron Dellums, who was a sophomore African-American from Berkeley, both wanted to get on the Armed Services Committee. And Hebert said, absolutely not. I'm not putting any pro-war, any anti-war people on this committee. But for reasons I won't, they're in the book, you can read about them. They both end up on the committee. And when they're distributing seats on the dais for the first day of the meeting of the committee, Hebert gets to the end of the line and says to Schroeder and to Dellums, well, you two have to share a chair because I don't consider you full members of this committee. So I asked Pat, what did you do? And she said, we shared a chair. Barney Frank later said it was the only half-assed thing Pat Schroeder ever did when a member of Congress. But so Hebert comes before the freshmen, and he leans on the table and he says, well, now, boys and girls, let me tell you how things work around here. And as I think Toby Moffett says in the book, well, that was the end of him. And they did end up voting out these three. But much more important, I think in some ways, Bert will tell me if I'm wrong on this, is the message that got sent to the other members, the other chairmen, 6 of whom, incidentally, retired between that meeting and the next Congress starting. And another few are out, like Wayne Hayes, who wasn't voted out, although he was recommended by the Steering and Policy Committee. He has a little problem with the Argentine firecracker, and he does. No, I'm sorry, that's Wilbur Mills. He has his own problem with Elizabeth Ray.
Right.
And he's out as well. So you have, by the time the next Congress takes place, over half of the chairmen are new, either because they've been voted out or because they've been sent a message by this really revitalized part of the Democratic caucus that your actions are going to be attributable to us. And I think if you look, for example, at Jamie Whitten, who's the
great example.
Appropriations Committee, I think before 74, his party voting record is something like 28%. And within a term or two after, it's 88%. It's not only more than the Southern Democrats, it's more than the Democratic caucus in general. And Jamie didn't go through any sort of philosophical change late in life. He just started counting the votes. And so they had sent a message, which really, I think, transforms, in some ways good, and in some ways it has its problems. This message that you get elected to your seat in Congress by your constituents, but you have no right to a chairmanship. That is an award that you get from the caucus, and to get that, you have to serve the caucus.
And I think that we've got some nice examples with the caucus chair, Phil Burton, the would-be speaker or majority leader, Richard Bolling, both of whom wanted to lead, and it turns out we might touch on that in a minute. But these guys come in with Speaker Carl Albert, and you were just down at the Carl Albert Center yesterday, and you treat Speaker Albert kindly in your book. When I was there in 75, 76, as far as I could see, the only thing Carl Albert wanted to get accomplished in 1976 was to bring the Magna Carta to the United States for the 200th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence.
Well,
and he succeeded.
Yeah,
he succeeded. But you might talk a little bit about, in some ways, Albert is the last of an old school of Rayburn, McCormick, then Albert. Although when he retires, he's only 68, as you point out.
Yeah.
And coming on the heels of that is Tip O'Neill, who is this extremely important transitional speaker in the House. So how did this group get along with those two speakers?
Well, Albert was very problematical for them. they weren't completely consistent. On the one hand, they wanted Albert to whip these older guys into line. On the other hand, they did not want Albert to whip them into line. And so they would have some very confrontational meetings with Albert, and they would make demands on him in terms of legislation to be brought to the floor or other kinds of caucus changes. And Albert was very much out of the old school. You know, he didn't view his powers as speaker as being able to manipulate the caucus as much as to manage the caucus, which, when you're a Democrat, is, you know, as John Boehner used to say about the Republicans, it's like trying to keep frogs in a wheelbarrow. It's not an easy thing. It's not an easy thing to do. And so he would occasionally, and not just from this new group. At one point, I think he had, in the book, I think I talk about, he had a meeting with reformers. I think it was even before the class of '74 gets elected, and they're berating him about how he's managing the House, and he says, you know, well, gee, I think some of you want to run the House. I think it's Frank Thompson from New Jersey who says, yeah, we do. And that's, of course, not something that that any speaker enjoys hearing. Albert privately it's interesting, privately he would say later that he actually had a lot of qualms about Vietnam, although he did not really exhibit that very clearly during his speakership. One of the points that I got when talking to some of his former staff and people who were around him was that they felt that he got inadequate credit for the reforms, because they say, you know, these things wouldn't have happened if he hadn't allowed it. I'm not sure that's exactly true, because most of these reforms, in fact, all of the reforms, take place in the Democratic caucus. They don't take place on the floor. And they take place in the caucus because the liberals have a majority in the caucus. If you went to the floor, you would have that old conservative coalition of the Southern Democrats and the Republicans, and you probably wouldn't have been successful. So Albert is caught in a very, very strange place. Now, Tip O'Neill in the early '70s wasn't the Tip O'Neill that everybody came to love in the old roly-poly, all politics is local. Tip was a pretty standard New England politician, but he had his antenna up, and he voted with the reformers on many key votes, including he was one of the co-sponsors of a reform that allowed for recorded votes to be taken more easily. If you got 20 people to request it, you could demand a recorded vote. And that was a huge change. Again, remember, Congress in the era that Carl Albert served most of his tenure was a very closed institution. You didn't have television. You didn't know what was going on in committees or on the floor. In many cases, members were not able to get copies of reports of the legislation that was being reported out. Reporters weren't allowed into markup sessions. It was really a closed operation. And I think Tip Tip had a sense that there was a new generation of people coming in, and he had to figure out how to relate them. He didn't necessarily understand them. One of my former bosses, George Miller from California, used to live in a house with Marty Russo, Leon Panetta, Chuck Schumer. It was called the frat house, and sometimes much worse. And I remember very clearly at one point, now this was obviously a few years later, they invited Tip over to have pizza. And I don't know if you know Tip O'Neill, but he's not the guy who dropped over for a slice of pizza. But he did, because he was a good politician. And he would just leave just saying, I don't know what you guys are doing. It was just the clashing of generations. But I think you're absolutely right, Bert. Tip was transitional. Tip understood television. Tip understood.
Yeah, the House became televised under Tip.
He opposed that. He
Yeah.
did not support that. Tip famously had the quote, if you put us on television, they're going to have pictures somebody picking his nose or scratching his ass. And again, I think television is one of those reforms which you would have to look at. Some of the people who opposed it had a point that was borne out in terms of the extent to which members began to speak to that television camera as opposed to engaging in debate, and the extent to which people came over the floor. But Tip was strongly opposed to it, and there's lots of stories about what ultimately happens with Tip and television.
Right, exactly.
But that's another question.
But I think that one of the things you get into at various points in the book are are a lot of substantive elements of what the class did or didn't do. But I think with Tip, I think you see crucial for him is that at some point, and remember he's representing Harvard as well as Boston and different, he ends up being against the war.
Yeah, yeah, and that's critical, because when I asked members, that's what they always mentioned. You know, it was interesting because their reputation is they were this big group of reformers. But when I would ask them, well, what was your position on reform before they ran, with a few exceptions, and mainly the academic types, like Andy McGuire or Tim Worth, they didn't know anything about reform. And in fact, I will tell you, several of them who have read the book have called me up and said, oh, now I understand what was going on when we got there, because the first 2 chapters of the book are this history of reform up until the campaign of 1974. They arrived in town, and Marty Russo famously said, you know, I didn't know who somebody shows up and says, we're going to vote against some chairman. And Russo was a fairly moderate Democrat at the point, said, well, I don't even know these guys. Why am I voting against them? And they were ultimately told that if you want to accomplish your legislative goals, you've got to make the chairman responsive to you. And you got to get rid of a few of them. I mean, they all said, the reason I ran is I wanted to end the war in Vietnam. And they were told by Phil Burton and by Don Frazier and Dave Obey and the other people who were veteran reformers, well, you're not going to end the war in Vietnam if the chairman of the committee won't even let you offer an amendment in committee on cutting off funding. And that sealed Hebert's fate. So Tip did make that change, although he was not initially.
No,
but of course, but he made that change, and that bought him credibility with the class of '74.
Yeah, I mean, I think stylistically, he's much more comfortable going to the White House having a drink with Ronald Reagan than he is going to have pizza at the frat house.
Yes.
And that's a lot of generational elements. You talk about, you've got a great chapter called Thermidor. And, you know, here, they rush the barricades, the reforms are created, and then 6 months, 8 months out, I'd forgotten this, but David Broder, who I dearly love, but pretty much a traditionalist realist. Saying, oh, look at these guys! You know, they're not doing anything. And the whole notion of Thermidor is the reaction sets in. So we've talked a little bit about the first heady days of the class of '74 with the throwing out the chairs, doing some reforms. But over even that first 2 years, they come to realize that things aren't as easy as they might have thought.
Yeah, and that's really true. They do maintain a certain level of unity behind the party. Somebody, we were talking earlier, I forget who, but mentioned Les Francis, who was Norm Mineta's AA when I was George Miller's, and Les gave me a great memo that he'd done when he moved over to the White House to work for President Carter that analyzed voting behavior and actually found that the class of '74 voted more loyally to the Democratic Party than the Democratic caucus in general. They were pretty reliable. But as Burt mentioned at the outset, they were a diverse group. There were conservatives, there were people who did not line up on numerous issues. Once it got into the legislative fights, they were all unanimous in support of reform, because reform, by definition, benefited them as junior members, whether that was making the chairs responsive or allowing them to select more prestigious subcommittees and even move into subcommittee chairmanships much more quickly, ability to offer amendments or manage bills on the floor. It didn't matter whether you were a liberal or a moderate or a conservative Democrat, you were going to benefit from those reforms. So they were unanimous on that. But once you started talking about actual legislative policy, then the normal sorts of regional, ideological, personal differences came to play. And they found that they were not able to deliver the same kind of unanimity. Unfortunately, they also found that even when they were, President Ford was using a lot of vetoes, and while they may have had 270 votes or 260 votes to pass a piece of legislation, they didn't have 292 votes to override vetoes. And so they became very frustrated. It was one of the reasons they became so frustrated with Speaker Albert as well. And so I thought it was important to tell that story that in a way, and they came to reluctantly admit it even at the time as you go through the newspaper accounts. You know, time has a way of making you focus on either what you philosophically believe in or whether you want to be reelected. People came to represent some diversity of issues, both on things like labor policy, farm policy, and a number of other, as well as the highly divisive issues that start appearing in 75, whether that's school busing or abortion or some of the others that are very divisive, both within the Democratic caucus and then also between the parties.
So one of the interesting things about the class of 74 is they came in, some people like Henry Waxman don't acknowledge that there are any Republicans in the class of 74, but there's some very important ones, Henry Hyde, Chuck Grassley still in Congress. But one of the things that occurred or didn't occur with the class of 74 is that they really won a lot of seats that they had no business winning, Republican seats. And so they go into 1976, and the predictions are, well, they'll lose 25, they'll lose 20 to 25 for sure. And two members lost.
Right.
I think two members lost. They actually gained, as you point out, one seat. What did these guys do? And it was mostly guys. I think there were 3 women.
Yeah, very few
in
women.
the in the class. Some good ones. Helen Minor, first rate. But there was really a man's group here. So what did they do?
Martha Keyes.
Martha Keyes, absolutely, from this district.
Right. They were really the early practitioners of what we would think of as modern campaign techniques, and there was a happy mixture of their own styles. One of them says, we're really products of the television age. They understand television. They understand the media. We had all these. I was there, so I can say we had all these incredible breakthrough technological innovations like fax machines. They weren't very
Robo-typewriters.
Robo-typewriters. I mean, you could actually mail out hundreds of letters a day. The fax machines were so horrible that I remember they produced a wet fax, and it stunk so badly. Remember, you had to go out in the hall. Everybody in the Longworth building had like little clotheslines with clothespins, and you would hang your fax out there to dry because they had watch lines where you could call in your district. They expanded enormously. One of the things that saved Wayne Hayes as the chairman of the House Administration Committee is he bumped up enormously the amount of money that the offices had, because they knew they had all these vulnerable seats that they probably shouldn't have won and were going to have difficulty hanging on to. And so they were given more staff. They were given more money to travel back to their districts. They were given more money for franked letters and for newsletters. And this group of people was very, very skilled and very creative. They even came up with ideas like mobile offices, where they would rent vans and drive around their offices. I remember we once had, in the Miller office, I came up with this idea, since we had this free phone line, in addition to calling my mother, when we would get a letter from someone, and they'd be all angry. The only angry ones are the only ones that write the letter. I would have Congressman Miller call them up and just say, "Hi, this is Congressman Miller. I'm calling to talk to you about your letter." And people would, "You've got to be kidding. I mean, you're calling me?" And you'd have a 5-minute conversation, and you knew that even though that person disagreed with you, there was a little check that went in their brain next to, "This person cares enough to pick up the phone and call me." They did aggressive use of town hall meetings. They were given these resources. So from day one, I think within the first couple of weeks after they were there, they were instructed by, they had that little discussion that you had in high school, look to your left, look to your right, 2 of you aren't going to be here in 2 years. But they were told, you have got to start from day one. They were actually criticized by the more senior members for caring more about being reelected than about doing their work. which was never the case with a senior member of Congress, and they never cared about getting reelected.
And one of the things that is interesting there is that given this ideological diversity, which might and did separate them on some issues, getting reelected was something they could share notes on, and I really think they learned from each other tremendously right from the beginning.
Absolutely. I mean, you would go down to the printer's office, Dave Androkaitis' office down in the basement of the Rayburn building, and you'd just go and steal everybody's newsletters and see what they were doing. And you'd say to the printer, just take this guy's story and this guy's story and this guy's story and put them together. And you could mail these newsletters out constantly. We used to mail out newsletters with questionnaires. And you would get the questionnaires back, and when people would send the questionnaires, they had told you what issue areas they were interested in, and then you would, this is all this pre-computer era, so this sounded like magic to us. But you'd end up at the end of the year with hundreds of people, so that every time the Congress voted on an education issue, or on a labor issue, or on a health issue, or an environmental issue, you sent those letters out to the people who were energized enough to write you, who almost by definition are people who are most likely to vote in any event. And so you now were connecting with people in a direct way and in a personal way that just had not been characteristic of the Congress up to that point.
So I got one general question here that I've been interested in for a long time, and then I want to run a few names by you so we could talk about, and there won't be, some of them will be obvious, some will be less obvious. But the general question is, at this time, the class of 74 and class of 76 behind it, all of these folks ended up moving up in the congressional hierarchy pretty quickly. I think by 1980, there were probably 45 of them left or so. Virtually everyone either had a power committee assignment or a subcommittee chair. And power was being spread out and spread out and spread out. At the same time, in 1977, Tip O'Neill takes control of the Rules Committee. He's able to appoint Rules Committee members. So it goes from being someone that might oppose him, that it's now an arm of the leadership, as Bruce Oppenheimer has called it. So there's this, and there's a centralizing force. So part of this what's going on is decentralization. Everybody's got a little piece of action. There's a contrary movement at the same time of trying to centralize. Clearly, centralization over the years has won out.
Yes.
But can you talk a little bit about how that manifests itself in the late 70s, maybe?
Yeah, and it's a really important point, because there was a fairly rapid turnover of membership, and then there were changes in the way in which people got selected for subcommittees and how they moved up into the subcommittees. And as a result, many of these younger people who might have ordinarily waited 10 to 12 years to get a subcommittee selection, which was difficult because before the reforms in 73, there were people who, the senior members were able to dominate not only the committees, but the subcommittees. There were a lot of people who had 3, 4 subcommittees that they were chairman of. So when they knocked it down and said you can only be chairman of one subcommittee, that opened up enormous numbers of opportunities, and as members retired, these younger people moved into senior positions. And what was significant about that is that combined with the diminished power and the necessary responsiveness of the chairman to the caucus, issues that had been bottled up because the chairman didn't want to have hearings on them and therefore would not authorize the subcommittee to do those hearings, you lost that control. And you had subcommittees doing investigations. You mentioned Henry Waxman among them. George Miller was too, but Tom Harkin. There were a lot of people who moved into, John LaFalce, moved into subcommittee chairmanships and began to very vigorously mine these for both legislative and for oversight purposes. So you had diminished in some ways the ability of the chairman to keep a cap on that. Because of course, if the subcommittee now could start working on a piece of legislation without the approval of the full committee, and it passed the legislation, the full committee chairman was going to be a little hesitant to say, well, I don't like that bill. We're not moving it any further, because those are the members who are going to look around and say, really? Maybe the next time we'll look for a chairman who will move that. And of course, the other members of the subcommittee would not want to be obstructive, because when they produce their own bills, they wouldn't want them to be voted down. So it created the movement of legislation that in a prior era would probably not have moved. It still went through what we refer to as regular order. You would have to have hearings, you would have to have markups, there would be opportunities for participation. You'd still have to convince then the leadership and rules to move the bill forward. But it allowed material subjects to percolate up that might not have been able to surface that quickly. At the same time, it required some controls because you couldn't have chaos on the floor. Some of these issues were very controversial, and when they did get to the floor, they caused deep divisions in the party. The votes were very divisive, and of course, members would go to the leadership and say, I don't want to have to keep voting on this stuff. You know, this doesn't work for me in my district. And so you did have this push and pull. I mentioned that TIP had been part of this effort to make it easier for members to get recorded votes. And the numbers of recorded votes skyrockets through the 1970s. And it goes from maybe 120 or 140 to 600 or something. There's massive numbers. And they get, some of the older guys, including some of the older reformers like Mo Udall, get very tired of this very quickly. And they say, we should really increase that number that you need to get the recorded vote. It's too easy. And it's not only Democrats, Republicans who have figured out that they can use this liberalized process, liberal with a non-ideological connotation to it, more open process to force votes that are going to be embarrassing to Democrats in these marginal districts. And so these older reformers come in and say, let's raise that up to 36. And my boy, I didn't even know this, and to be honest about it, he didn't remember it either, but I found it in a dusty old document, literally in the bottom of a drawer in the parliamentarian's office. There's a motion in 1976 to raise that number to 36, and Miller gets up and says, and this is 1976, he says, no, I don't think we should do that. He said, democracy is messy, but someday Democrats may be in the minority in the Congress, and we're going to want to be able to offer amendments too. So, and interestingly, it's defeated, and they stay at 20 votes. A couple of years later, everybody's had enough, and they do raise it to 33. So there was a limit on how open the process they were allowing it to be.
So one of the great parts for me of this book, probably more so for me than almost anybody else's, is that John goes through an accounting of all the members of the class of 1974. And I'm going to ask him about a couple, but I just want some names. Henry Hyde, Republican, the Hyde Amendment, profoundly powerful member given his minority status, brought abortion front and center to the Congress. Chris Dodd becomes Senator Tom Dodd's son. Andy Jacobs had left the Congress, came back. One of the most iconoclastic persons you'd ever want to meet. You'd want one or two Andy Jacobs in a Congress. More than three, and you got a problem.
Yeah. Sometimes one was too many.
Carol Hubbard, the first New Members Caucus, who subsequently spent 2 years in federal prison. Not the only person to go to jail from this class, by a long shot. And the guy,
they say anybody can run for Congress.
Right. I've only gotten to the C's so. I'm in Michigan. You didn't do it. You did it alphabetically by state. But let's start with someone that not too many people in this room probably have heard of or know much about. Bob Carr. Bob Carr was a star.
Yeah.
And then,
what
happened?
So Bob Carr actually runs in 1972 and narrowly loses.
From Michigan.
In Michigan. But the district is changed slightly in the reapportionment that takes effect in 74, and he decides that he has a better shot at winning. He actually, I mentioned this in the book, he as he's casting around to put together his 1974 campaign, he asks another person who's in the district attorney's office, Jim Blanchard, if he would like to work on his campaign for him. And Jim Blanchard is actually running in another seat for his own.
Who won?
Who won and then became ultimately governor of Michigan and ambassador to Canada. But Carr is very charismatic. He's very young. I think he was maybe 31 years old. Sort of looks is a dead ringer for Mark Spitz, and comes into the Congress, is one of the real firebrands. But Carr, in April of 1975, gets to offer the amendment in the Democratic caucus to terminate funding for Vietnam. And this is just when Ford is coming and asking for an extra, I think it was $600 million to continue a largely non-combat presence. And it passes. And Carr's star just goes into absolute orbit. Now, anybody could have offered that amendment because there were probably 75 Democrats who would have liked to. But he offers it, it passes, and Carr becomes a major star. Only a few months later, he's one of those people who becomes extremely frustrated with the inability of the leadership to overcome the Ford vetoes. And he goes on, I think it was the Today Show, and he calls for the speaker to resign. And that star fades. And Bob's actually still a friend of mine, and we have coffee every once in a while. He teaches at George Washington University. And he literally told me, he said, it took years for me to recover my reputation. He ends up being defeated in 1980, I think it is, maybe 82, but I think 80. Comes back in 82, and then runs for the Senate and loses. But when he comes back in the early 80s, he's a much chastened guy and is not nearly the firebrand. So he, Congress, as we talk about in that chapter on Thermidor, has a certain temporizing influence. I was telling somebody earlier today that when I remember Miller would always, these guys wanted to play on all these issues. The committee had nothing to do with it. If I wanted to offer an amendment on the Ag Committee to increase food stamps, or somebody wanted to offer an amendment on the Public Works Committee to cut funding for water projects, it didn't matter if you were on that committee. They were all over the map. It was, we have the right to stand up and offer these amendments. So then, of course, Miller becomes chairman of the Education Committee, and I'm his staff director, and he says, people coming to him and say, well, when your bill is on the floor, I want to be able to offer, the following amendment. And he says, if you want to offer an amendment, get on the committee. I say, George, that's not what you guys were saying. So once again, where you stand depends on where you sit.
I want to leave plenty of time for questions. So I'm going to skip a whole bunch, and there's some great stories. Freddie Richmond, who got on the Ag Committee in 1975. It was offered to Shirley Chisholm. They were jerking her around. She said, no way. Freddie Richmond says, I'm going to get on the Ag Committee because food stamps. And it was huge. He was from Brooklyn. And it was a terrific move.
That was the high point of his career, however.
There's many stories. He didn't go to jail, but he was indicted, and with some other stuff, too. I'm going to skip over Steve Solarz, although he's a remarkable guy. I want you to talk a little bit about two of your California congressmen who ended up being the longest continual serving members of the House among Democrats, and that's George Miller and Henry Waxman. Because I think that one of the things you think about, I've written about the impact of a class, and some of it's when you first come in, how long you stay together. But there's also a long tail, and some of the most talented people, and I would say George Miller and Henry Waxman were two, had this 40-year presence in the Congress, ended up being committee chairs, and had a huge impact on policy.
And again, full disclosure, I worked for Miller for 30 years before I went over to work for Pelosi, but I think that is a fair assessment. You don't get to serve for 40 years. Miller, in his case, chaired 3 different committees in the Congress. Waxman chaired 2. I think there were some real similarities between them, although in many ways they're very different. Henry represented the West LA, Hollywood crowd, and a very safe district. Miller represented a largely working class that sort of morphed into a suburban.
And he succeeded his father.
Well, no, his father was a state senator.
Oh,
there was
okay.
another George Miller, but it wasn't
No,
him.
okay, right.
Yeah. And, but they both came out of families where, out of experiences where there was, before they got to Washington, a very strong legislative tradition. So Henry had served in the state legislature for a number of years, and he was actually a formidable power in the state
Right.
legislature in California. Miller had not served, but his dad had been a very prominent state senator, chairman of the Finance Committee, and then Miller had, after his father died in office, run and lost for that Senate seat, but then went to work for the Senate Majority Leader, a guy named George Moscone. So they both arrived in Washington very, very focused on the legislative process and with a lot of issues. And what I find interesting about Henry George is not that they were legislatively active, but the breadth of the areas that they were legislatively active. So Henry Waxman, whether, you know, the litany of issues that you can reel off that he personally was responsible for shaping: clean air, clean water, health, just through the first chairmanship of the Government Reform Committee, and then the chairmanship of the Energy Committee, energy policy, environmental policy, alternative energy development. Miller was chairman of the Natural Resources Committee. He was the leading person on national parks, public lands, Western water development, Native American rights, investigations of abuses in the American territories. Then he shifts over and becomes first the ranking member and then the chairman of the Education Committee, and is the champion of special education and of K through 12, and then rewrites the laws on college grants, and is the main author of pension reform legislation and occupational disease compensation legislation. And the sheer breadth of these two guys is enormous. And one of the things I think is important to note about them is they were both people who eschewed any interest in the leadership. They
Right.
decided that their careers were in the committees and in the legislature. And that makes a big difference. And one of the ways it makes a difference is you cannot succeed. I mean, even in that era of the permanent Democratic majority, you can't succeed unless you can work across the aisle. You just can't do it. And both of these guys were as hard-nosed partisans. I mean, they would not once have said, I would like a Republican to win a specific race. But they knew that, and I mean, this gets more into my contemporary riff on what's wrong with politics. Legislation that goes through the normal process, that's the subject of hearings, it's a subject of markup, that you have to defend, you have to bring in outside critics, you have to answer questions, you have to go through score, all the things that you sort of go through in the normal process, and that build through that time and that experience a bipartisan, even if it's not overwhelming, those are the bills that endure, those are the policies that endure, because people buy into them because they've gone through that process. They've made it through the process. That's what Miller and Waxman really did, and they ended up passing a lot of legislation.
And I think that the fact we're sitting in the Dole Institute, that perfectly describes Bob Dole as someone who's a hard-edged partisan. No one's going to, you know, but he always knew that he had to go across the aisle, and often did.
Yes.
Okay, I mean, there's a zillion more things. A key thing here is that the class of '74 never went into leadership.
No.
2 years later, Dick Gephardt comes in and ascends rapidly through the, and you know, kind of both very successful, but a different kind of.
Yeah.
They were more organizational, as you point out. These guys, the '74 people, from whatever background, they were a little more policy wonky, and even you know, some of them right away got stuff done. But then the Millers, and not just the Millers and the Waxmans, but a lot of them hung in there, Oberstar, whatever, and
Oberstar Harkin was in for
yeah.
a very long time.
Okay, we could sit here and talk about these guys forever, but we've got about 15 minutes or so. If we could have questions. Yeah, Doug.
Question, what impact does this have on today, on the blue wave that was predicted today by a Wisconsin governor and what we see happening in American politics?
Well, I always like to say I'm a historian, so I'm better looking backwards than I am looking forwards.
There's been a political scientist learned in 2016 that prediction is not the greatest thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think, well, of course, Scott Walker predicting the blue wave, I think he's using jujitsu there. That's his way of trying to raise money for, which I don't blame him for doing. I think, you know, I mentioned at the outset that all these seeming parallels between today and 1974. And certainly this talk we're hearing of wave elections. It's interesting, there were these elections in early 1974 that were sort of the harbinger of this blue wave that was coming. Election of, most important probably was Richard Van der Veen, who won an open Michigan seat in March of 1974, which happened to belong to Gerald Ford. I mean, and so the seat that was vacated by the vice president of the United States went to a Democrat. I like to point out that it was a seat in western Pennsylvania. It was won by a war veteran who was running against the standard Democratic platform on a number of issues, John Murtha. And I look at Connor Lamb, who just wins a western Pennsylvania seat, running against a war veteran running against. So you can draw those kinds of easy parallels. I think it's much harder to predict right now because what you didn't have in 1974, which you do at this point, is this ideological stratification of the parties, and you didn't have the levels of partisanship that make it much trickier to figure out where voters are going to move. I mean, there are lots of political scientists who've done these charts that talk about where in the 1980s large masses of members were in terms of moving back and forth on issues and how that has shrunk and basically disappeared at this point. So, and that I think reflects the electorate to at least a participatory electorate to a large sense, and particularly in an off-year election. So I think it's a difficult thing to predict. You know, anecdotally, you hear Democrats are more energized, and Republicans are more defeatist or disenchanted. Certainly, if you look at the Connor Lamb victory or the Jones victory in Alabama, or at the even maybe more important is the large number of Democratic seats in state legislatures that have been won since 2016, you would have to say something's going on. Personally, and I say this without perfectly willing to be corrected by Broder, by any political scientists or election analysts or these students here who seem to know what they're doing, I think the factor that I would watch more than anything else is Republican turnout. I'm not sure in a highly polarized environment that a lot of people who are traditional Republican voters are going to say, I'm going to go vote for the Democrat this time. Even though the Democrats are going to nominate a lot of people who are non-traditional, sort of, you know, we got a lot of veterans who are running. And but I think that if you have 8 to 10% of Republicans deciding they're just not going to vote because they don't like the president or they don't like the Congress or whatever, they're just disenchanted, I think you're going to see a lot of seats that people would assume are safe seats or reasonably safe seats switch over, and you could see that kind of a wave. Whether you see 20, the average is 30 seats in an off-year election for the party out of power. That doesn't quite take into account gerrymandering, which we can get into if you want to. But you know, just from Connor Lamb's victory and the Pennsylvania reapportionment decision, we're probably down to 19 seats that have to switch rather than 25. And so things are starting to narrow.
I think if you want to look at a comparison to 74, it's not so much whether Democrats win control by switching 23, 24 seats or not, which they might well do. If you do that, I think you're not going to get many surprises. You might get a Paul Davis, who's a pretty conventional politician. If you go to 40 or 45 or 50 seats, you're going to find 20 people who decided kind of on a whim to run, or they're ticked after the Trump election or a mass shooting or whatever. Many of them women, I think. And they will come in, if it's a class of 40 to 50, then I do think you've got some parallels because they're coming in not as professional politicians, people who even thought they were going to win, but they got in for one reason or another, just as many of the folks in '74 did. So I think that the first cut of competitive seats that look good, that's one cut, but some others might win, and my guess is that some will, that are totally unexpected. And that would make it more interesting and a little bit more like the class of '74.
So,
Yes.
okay. So I'm kind of, I guess I was a little surprised because it struck me that in '74, if I'm remembering this right, the looming specter of Watergate, you know, I think the Pentagon Papers maybe had come out by the time of the election. And then,
Sure.
of course, I'm trying to think back from '75 when Nixon resigned. I
No,
know
no,
No, 74.
74.
August 8th,
He was
74.
August of '74.
Okay, okay. And now, you know, of course, we have the looming specter of Russiagate. So, well, I guess what I was curious about was there wasn't, when you were explaining the context of these people coming in, it doesn't sound like you thought Watergate was a particularly important element of that. It must have been very demoralizing to Republicans, but no.
Well, I think Watergate was more of a factor with the electorate in terms of who turned out and how they voted than it was as a motivator for people running. When most of these people made their decisions to run in late 1973 and early 1974, the investigations were still at an uncertain stage. The House, you were months away from the impeachment hearings, for example. You had the Irvin Committee, but you didn't have Nixon resigning. You didn't have the tapes coming out. You didn't have Supreme Court. Those all occurred in the spring and summer of 1974. So by that point, these people were in. And by the time they got in, Watergate was over. So it's not a factor in the election in terms of the extent to which now people might be running in 2018 and saying, will you vote to impeach Trump if you get in? Impeachment really was not on the horizon except for, you know, a fairly fringe group when most of these guys were making decisions to run. And when I asked them about that, they overwhelmingly said, no, that wasn't an issue. They certainly benefited by, if not by Watergate, they benefited by the Ford pardon. They felt that the air just went out of the, Republicans felt the air went out of the balloon when that happened. And I actually tell the story in the book. The publisher said, don't tell them what's in the book because they won't buy it, but I don't care. A group of Republicans goes down to the White House. Ford asks them to come down to the White House in, I guess it was late August, maybe very beginning of September. And he says, look, I'm going to pardon Nixon because this thing's just going to drag. If we don't, it's going to drag all through 1975. 1976, it's going to really screw up my campaign in 1976. And they said, yeah, okay, but see, we're a little more concerned about the campaign in 1974. So don't do that because that's only 2 months away. And then he goes ahead and does it. And I think the air goes out of a lot of people. I have a story in the book. It's more about the release of the tapes, but where you could just see these Republicans who had stuck with Nixon, particularly the Judiciary Committee guys who had stuck with Nixon to the very end, and the tape comes out, and they just, you know, they know that the jig is up. And as a result, you get this turnout problem where even people who had, people like Bill Widnall in New Jersey, who's the head of the ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee, and generally looked upon as a good bipartisan, not, you know, crazy by any means. He just gets blown away, you know, in this. So it has that effect with the electorate, but I don't think it was a big determinant in terms of recruiting the members.
I'm really enjoying hearing about the personalities and talents of the congressmen in the 70s. Do you have any impressions or memories of our Kansas Congressman Keith Sebelius that you could share?
Do I? See, no, I am sorry.
There's a majority guy. They paid no attention to the minority. Yeah.
Oh, were there Republicans there then? Yeah. No, I didn't. Kathy's ability to say no, but no, I didn't know. I didn't. I mean, the whole Republican issue. I mean, I don't mean that dismissively. Well, I guess it sounded that way. I actually have a whole chapter in the book about Republicans, and it turned out to be one of the most fun chapters to do, because again, those of you who are political scientists or historians in particular know that from 1932 to 1994, the Democratic Party is in control of the House of Representatives. It's a 62-year period. Democrats are in control of all but 4 years of that period of time, largely because they had this large slug of Southern Democrats. But late in 1968, Kevin Phillips writes this book where he says, if you look at the trajectory here and you see what's going to happen in these southern and suburban districts, not only in the South, but also in the Midwest and Northeast suburban districts, we're actually on a projection here where we can contest for the majority. Then Watergate happens, and they lose 49 seats. It takes them 10 years to get back to where they were in 1974. So that's all these people that Byrd mentioned who get elected, and they manage because of incumbency or just being good politicians or drawing bad opponents to hang on for 3-4 terms. They start falling away by the mid-'80s, and the Republicans start getting up to the point where they numerically they're equivalent. At the exact same time, you have this infusion of this new conservative ideological group, heavily Southern-based, evangelical, and they view the Republican leadership as much of the problem as they do the Democrats, because they see these people who have sort of the permanent collaborationist mentality of I'm always going to be in the minority. I've got to sit around the piano with Tip and play music, and as opposed to this newer group of people who says we've got to go in there and set off some depth charges and make trouble, because that's the only way we're ever going to. So that's a really, and a lot of the people, the Republicans elected in '74 are very uncomfortable with that. And they tend to drift off pretty fast. They either run for the Senate or they retire. It's just not the type of environment that they're comfortable with.
As I recall, I can envisage Peter Rodino and the House Impeachment Committee, the Irwin Committee, and as I think the general opinion of Congress increased significantly after those events. Did that have any bearing on the elections in '74? I mean, the people were thinking more positively about Congress, or were they?
You know, Byrd, you may know the numbers. I can't off the top of my head remember if the numbers, if people ran polls on that or tested it. But
I think there was there was seen as.
But I think what's important about that, recalling that, is that with the exception of the Army McCarthy hearings and one set of hearings, I believe, by HUAC, which was unauthorized in the 1950s, most people had never seen Congress functioning before, because there was no television coverage, there was no radio coverage. So what we think of now, C-SPAN, or just sort of normally you click on the TV and you watch a debate or you watch a committee hearing, that didn't happen. Many of the hearings were closed. Many of the votes were taken secretively or taken in the committee of the whole in the House, and by teller votes. You had no idea. You literally had people sitting up on the gallery watching to see what they said when the members filed up and secretly told people that they were going to vote. So one of the real important innovations in the 1970s related to Watergate was people saw Congress functioning, and they saw Congress being serious and doing, in many cases, being bipartisan. I mean, they saw Howard Baker playing a key role in the Irwin Committee, I think, I would say impressionistically, the respect for the institution rose, and I would say beyond that, their own respect grew, and they institutionalized the oversight function to a very great degree, so that one of the reforms that the class strongly supports is insisting that each committee have an oversight committee. And that's important both in terms of of the Congress, but in terms of the operation of Congress, but also in terms of the Congress reasserting itself in response to the imperial presidency, which is a big bipartisan movement through the 1970s.
And I think the link here between the public perception, which I agree with, and these new members is they came in maybe naively, thinking they could really do stuff.
Yep.
I mean, and so they did hit the ground running. Now they might have been going in various directions, but they were optimistic that they could make the institution work. I think, and I think that part of that was the Urban Committee, the Rodino Committee. Remember, the floor hadn't been televised, so this was really new stuff. Maybe one question, and I think we need to wrap it up. One question? A question? Oh, here we go.
Thank you for coming out tonight. Earlier you talked about kind of the extreme partisanship that faces us today, and whether, based on patterns of history or your predictions, do you think that there is a way to change that? How do you think that's going to change if it does change? Do you think that's an important issue that needs to be addressed, especially as younger people are moving up in politics?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that's sort of a subtitle of the book, and my point in doing that, in both the name and in the way it's written, is to explain that I think the origins of our contemporary partisanship problems are very deep, and they go back decades. I tell people that they ask, because I get asked this question a lot, this is not something that somebody's going to get elected and change. Partisanship has been institutionalized in the party, and some of it is subject to change, and some of it is much more difficult. So you can address, I think, some of it, and there's a debate within the political science community about the role of primaries, for example, and another reform that seemed like a really good idea, but that really empowers fringe groups within parties to control nominations. Would Connor Lamb have won a primary in Pennsylvania? No, he would not have. But he was picked by the organization as the person most likely to win because he could draw other votes. So I think there are institutional things like that can change. I think, but you've also had the rise of a highly ideologically based media that, you might trace back to the 1987 decisions to get rid of the fairness doctrine. You might change back just to the technological changes of cable and independent money. You've had changes in the way in which we, again, partly in response to the reform of the 1974 campaign finance law, where the explosion of PACs, and then that gets compounded by Citizens United and McCutcheon and other decisions that really changes the nature of campaign finance. Those are all difficult things, particularly the constitutional issues, to turn around. They're deeply ingrained in the national psyche, and it's reflected, of course, in this rebalancing of the party, so that the parties now are, you have not only partisanship, but the partisanship is between two parties, as opposed to just being ideological within the parties. And so the two things I say that are significant, and I don't have a great, well, I have more hopes for one than the other. One is politicians will, I think anybody who's worked in politics will hopefully agree with this, politicians do what they get rewarded to do, just like puppies. If they get spanked, they're not going to do that again. And in a politician, that means if they cast a vote, that means that they're going to get money against them, or going to become the subject of cable TV attacks or grassroots organizations attacks in their district. They're very reluctant to do that stuff. So we've got to figure out ways to reward people for doing things that are collaborative as opposed to punishing them. And if you don't do that, then I will guarantee politicians, just like probably anyone else in this room, is probably going to continue to do the things that allow them to do what they want to do, part of which is continue to be in public office. The second part of that, which I think is doable, is we've got to figure out ways to get people to vote. Because the biggest problem we face, I think, in many respects, even though I understand that people who don't vote may not be quite as motivated or as well informed, but that's, democracy doesn't work well when 2/3 of the people or 60% of the people decide they're not going to vote in primaries, or 40% of the people decide they're not going to vote in general elections. We just had, in these special elections, you have, 38, 40% of the people turning out. course, you have the primaries where you have a plurality of maybe 18 or 20% participants picking the major party candidates. That just doesn't work. You know, I realize I think we can easily get rid of some of the voter intimidation laws, which I think are pretty clear what they're designed to do. But a lot of the non-participation isn't due to voter intimidation, it's just due to voter apathy. And I know it's hard to get people to participate in something that they don't respect. They don't, you know, it's like the Go Groucho marching. I don't want to be a member of any club that would have me for a member. You know, they don't want to participate because they devalue the institution. But when you cede your political power because you don't vote, then you're just empowering the opponent. I think one of the best things that I found in my students is they've been empowered by what's been going on in American politics. I mean, I would not have predicted between the 2016 election, the gun issues. I would really just have assumed that they thought, you know, this thing just stinks. I'm going to go off and get a job in, you know, Google or something. And they're not. They're saying they're empowered. And so maybe that changes the dynamic. But all those other issues are going to depend upon whether or not we can bring people back into the system, and particularly people who are not just going to continually reward the most extreme and divisive views. Because the politicians are reflecting what they're hearing in the public. Okay, they're not making it up on their own, you know, to behave that way.
On that semi-optimistic note, I want to thank John Lawrence for coming.
Thank you.
Sharing.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Appreciate it so much.